This is Roger Simon for PJTV. Back in 1995, then U.S. Assistant Attorney for the Southern District of New York, Andrew C. McCarthy, led the terrorism prosecution against Sheikh Omar Abdul Rahman and 11 others. They were convicted of 1993's World Trade Center bombing and planning a series of attacks against New York City landmarks. He also contributed to the prosecution of terrorists who bombed U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania. Before leaving the Justice Department in 2003 to become an author, he wrote a book about his prosecution of Rahman, The Blind Sheikh, and political pundit. Today, he officially joins PJ Media as one of our full-time columnists. Welcome, Andy. You are officially now our prisoner.
Well, it's nice to be here, Roger. Nice to be welcome.
Well, now we'll look into your plans for the column in a minute, but you're also nearing completion on a new book about the so-called Arab Spring. Tell us something about it.
Yeah, Roger Kimball, who's my our good friend and my publisher at Encounter Books, and I talked for long and hard about how to deal with the Arab Spring, since it really does kind of follow on to or from some of the things I've been covering over the years. So we came up with a project called, which I think this will actually be the title, the Spring Fever, The Illusion of Islamic Democracy. And I'm hoping
it's a good song.
Yeah, I'm hoping it'll be out in the summertime.
Roger Kimball tells me that's going to be an ebook.
That's right. One of the things I was concerned about, as you can imagine, with the Arab Spring is that developments are happening so fast, and it's such a moving target that if you handled it like a traditional book, so that I'd hand in a manuscript and 4 or 6 months later you get a book, if you're and that's moving quickly, that the world could look much different from at the time of publication than it did at the time of the manuscript, or I'd spend the next months in between crazily rewriting it or changing it or adding new details. So the upside of an ebook, at least as I understand it, is once it's done, you can get it out fairly quickly. And as there are new developments, you can actually add to it. So in some ways, it can become a better, more contemporaneous product.
Maybe we're moving toward an era of serial books, like something like yours. Bashar Assad finally gets killed or something, and another chapter gets added to it, and then another chapter as the Muslim Brotherhood takes over or whatever happens.
It's an interesting question, because what I've always thought the great thing about books is, compared to the kind of journalism we do day in and day out, is generally the good ones are ones where you have a little bit of time to let things bake, see how things have developed and come out, and be a little more analytical about them. I'm a little frightened by the thought of trying to do analysis on the fly. On the other hand, this is something I've been writing about for probably a decade now, and I've not to toot my own flute too much, but I think I've pretty accurately called what would happen up until this point. So I haven't been surprised by any of it, and I don't think anyone who's read my first 2 books would be surprised by what's happened if they read them.
Here's something I've always wanted to ask you, and didn't over dinner or at any time or anything. How did you what prompted you to make the transition from being an attorney, a prosecutor in these heavy-duty trials, into being a historian, pundit, journalist, whatever you want to call yourself, or all of the above?
Well, it's interesting. I've always loved to write. Ever since I was a kid, it was what I liked more than anything else. And even as a prosecutor, I always wanted to be the kind of lawyer who could do everything well, but the writing part of it and the analytical part of it was always more attractive to me than some of the other parts. So to me, this has been almost a seamless transition, because the training of a trial lawyer is to take things that are often complicated and infused with pretty complex legal statutes and standards that apply to them, and break them down into narratives that ordinary people can wrap their brains around and understand. And I think if you can do the type of lawyering that I did fairly well that this type of experience, this type of journalism is something you can, at least I've been able to transition into. Whether I've succeeded or not is somebody else to judge, but I haven't found it difficult to make the transition.
Well, speaking of analysis and transitions and so forth, here's a self-serving question. And what prompted you to now go ahead with us and bring your talents here to PJ Media in a new column?
Well, I've been a big admirer of PJ Media from the get-go. I find myself reading it quite a lot. Some of the people I most admire, particularly in the conservative movement, but not just, have written for PJTV and are regular commentators there. So it's really, to me, both a challenge and humbling to join a stable of people like that. But it's also something that I'm very proud to do because of the admiration I have for those folks.
It's humbling to have you because, I have been an admirer of what you did since, of course, the Rahman case. But one last question. Was that your first book then, or first serious piece of writing, Willful Blindness, coming out of that case? This question comes from being a lifetime writer who, is envious here.
Yeah, well, that's, I don't think so, because I was, Roger, if it hadn't been for Roger Kimball, I don't know that the book would ever have gotten written. It was always something that I wanted to do, but I was out, as you pointed out before, from 2003. Willful Blindness was not something I did until 2008, so it was about 5 years down the road. And it was something I really struggled with whether to do. It was a story that I always wanted to tell because I think it's an interesting story just as a piece of history. It's a time in our country where we dealt with and are continuing to deal with a profound challenge, and I had the fortuity of being on what passed for the front lines of it when it first hit our shores. So it's interesting from somebody, I think, from the inside to be able to tell what it was like to deal with the challenge of Islamic terrorism at that time, why we dealt with it as a courtroom matter rather than a war matter, which is what it became after 9/11. On the other hand, I've always believed that when important decisions have to be made in the government or really any place else, when people get behind closed doors to make them, you have to be able to count on the idea that you're getting everybody's most frank, best, most creative judgments in terms of whatever they're able to put on the table and lend to the solution of a problem. And if you're always worried that the guy next to you is going to write it all down and you'll be reading about it in the New York Times tomorrow, you're not apt to give your best advice. So I had to really struggle with what I thought was the importance of doing the book as a piece of history, but doing it in a way that didn't violate those kind of confidences. And I think people who read the book can judge for themselves how successful it was, but I'm pretty satisfied that to the extent I was hard on people, I was hard on myself as well.
But now you see yourself as a full-time writer, you're not going to return to the legal field. Are you anticipating that, or do you?
Well, you never know what will happen, but I do say I've been away for 10 years now. And one thing about lawyering is if it's going to be done right, I don't think it's a part-time job. I think it's the sort of thing you really have to throw yourself into. And I did try for a while to walk the line of trying to keep my feet in both worlds. And what you find, I think, is, especially as a lawyer, you're kidding yourself a little bit because there's no such thing as a small problem. You can con yourself into thinking that somebody's got a small issue and it'll just need a little bit of tinkering. But in my experience, and maybe I'm just a magnet for this sort of stuff. But when I get involved in something, it tends to become more complicated than it was pitched to me in the first instance. And maybe it's just me. Maybe I just overcomplicate things. But at least for me, to practice law is a full-time job, and it's one I loved when I did it, but I love what I'm doing now too.
Well, Thank you for joining us, and thank you for the new column. We'll be reading it carefully. I want to remind you, of course, that we don't edit you, unlike other publications you may have written for, except for occasional running in to correct somebody's spelling, not mine ever. Anyway, Andrew McCarthy is our newest PJ Media columnist, and you can find him by visiting pjmedia.com. He is also best-selling author, and you can read his book about the prosecution of the blind sheikh in Willful Blindness, a memoir of the jihad. That book, as well as many others he's written, is available online at encounterbooks.com. And be sure to keep a lookout for his latest, Spring Fever, which should be available this summer. For PJTV, I'm Roger Simon.